So I'm really excited to, let me just get to my notes here, sorry. So I'm really excited to facilitate this panel. The title of the panel is Barriers to Entry for Emerging Tech and Small Firms. Our research and discussions around the world over time has revealed one common theme. I was actually at a World Bank event in Washington. It was actually just about this theme. While the government market is supposed to be open and transparent, a lot of the rules and regulations and the complexity that's been formed over time has actually made it more closed. So many suppliers find it complex, costly, slow, and overwhelming. And because of that, many suppliers choose not to compete. And ultimately, that's a disservice and a loss to all of us. Because one thing I like to say is, just like in human resources, when you're recruiting top talent has many places to go. They are not going to come to places where it's difficult to get to, right? Similarly, great companies, they have many places to take their business. And so how do we get those companies in? And how do we get all the programs and all the procurement professionals that are trying to get to those companies, make it easier for them to get to them? So with that, we have a great panel. We have Shelly Kapoor Collins, who's the managing director and founder, as I mentioned earlier, of Shatter Fund. Welcome, Shelly.
Thank you. Thanks.
And then we have Michael Hermus, who's the former CIO and at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And now he's also an entrepreneur himself. And then we have Sky Kelley, who's also a local LA native. So we're excited to have her here. Founder and CEO of Avisare, and she'll tell us more about that. So I'd like to just start out. I always like to start out panels with just getting everybody engaged quickly. So I'd like to start out with a speed round, I call it. And so I'll make sure you keep your answers very, very short. So let's start with the first question here. When you think of the opportunities for companies in the government, what is the first thing that comes to mind? So from a company standpoint, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
It's too hard. It's too hard, and I don't want to take a chance, and I don't want to waste my time because it's just not going to happen.
Okay. You were supposed to start on a positive note.
Okay.
So opportunity.
I want to make a lot of money, and government contracts are really lucrative.
Okay. No, that's great.
Yeah, I was going to say pain and suffering, but I guess that's not. I guess that's
Thank
not
you.
positive.
Positive.
I agree. I think that I would say the opportunity to make money is there, but really the thing that draws many folks, federal or employees as well as companies, is the mission. That if you can actually help serve the government mission, whether it's federal or state or local, you really make a difference in the world, and that's compelling to a lot of folks.
That's great. Scott?
I would say that it's the massive amount of opportunities that do exist. When we talk to a lot of small businesses who aren't familiar in the space, they're often surprised at just how many things the government does actually purchase. The government being the #1 purchaser of goods and services in this country. So there's just a massive opportunity.
Great. And just to give everyone a sense of that, there's $2 trillion spent in the U.S. by local, state, and federal governments. $2 trillion. So second question as part of our speed round. Sounds like a game show. So now similarly, when you think of the opportunity for government in terms of accessing innovative solutions in the market, so what do you think the government is thinking, again, from a positive standpoint?
Yes.
What is the first thing that comes to mind?
I would say that for the government, in terms of the companies that they want to attract, they should be thinking, how can we operate like a private sector business? How can we operate from an innovative standpoint? Because ultimately, the goal is to bring efficiencies and savings to the citizens of the government. And so that should be the first thing they think. How do we leverage these technologies to serve our customers who are our constituents and citizens?
Great.
So I think the word is change for me. the driving thesis for why I'm here, why you started this organization, is that the rate of pace in technology is far outstripping the rate of pace of change in government in general. And so when I think of the opportunity for government to engage with innovative technology companies, it's about being able to start figuring out ways to harness that technology to change, to be more adaptable, to actually better deliver those services and capabilities to the public.
Great. Sky?
I think right now is a better time than any time for government entities to be able to access innovation. The rise of civic tech, which really wasn't a thing 10 to 15 years ago, is expansive right now. There are so many companies who want to be in the space, so many companies innovating in the space, and the barriers to entry are very low for new innovation in the space. So I think this is actually a great time for government to be able to access that.
Yeah, I'll go off script a little bit here, and I'll just ask a question related to that. So I'll come back to our original questions, but let me just ask you, so first kind of question around that is, maybe Sky, you could start. What do you think is driving that? You're seeing more civic tech and the movement towards that. What do you think what are the underlying drivers behind that?
I think there are a few different things. I think one, just the tech space in general, with the barriers to entry of starting a new technology company being lower than they've ever been. You're seeing more and more people get into the space. I think the rise of entrepreneurship in general is a theme, I'd say, that's going on. I started my first company almost 10 years ago, and in New York. It was a different time and different space. But when I would tell people I was an entrepreneur, they would say, "Oh, that means you're unemployed." Whereas you don't have that now. People think it's cool to be an entrepreneur. They're excited about it. They want to work for startup companies. And I think there's just been a real feeling, a real emphasis over the last 5 to 10 years of wanting to get involved and wanting to make change and understanding that you can make change. And government is the best way to do that in a really big way. So you're especially seeing youth nowadays wanting to do something that involves civic engagement. So when you marry those two things, I think it's a really big opportunity right now.
That's a great point.
I think there's a growing recognition and a growing sense of urgency from some, not as urgent as I would like, that the government really needs help. And that they're falling further and further behind in a number of dimensions. And so I think you're seeing a lot of folks that because of those low barriers to entry are saying, look, I can both make some money, be an entrepreneur, but also do something that really matters, as I said before. And I think that growing sense of recognition is driving, underlying that drive towards civic tech.
And I think also from the government's standpoint, I was an appointee in the Obama administration, and so I was there and saw how, the White House implemented the USDS, United States Digital Service, as well as the innovation arm of the DoD, which is the DIUX, which brings in innovative technologies into government, not by bypassing RFPs, but by creating a new system for it. And so I think that there's also recognition on the government's part that we want to bring in these folks, and we need the innovative technologies. And on the part of the citizens and the people that wanted to go do these jobs, it's not easy, as we know, but it's seen as a tour of duty, right? This is the way to serve. This is how you can get back, and you apply your tech skills to the government. And that was really successful.
And I'll say that, what I found interesting, and we'll have a panel on this later about hacking the procurement process, and we'll hear a bit more about that, is, one thing I've also seen is how quickly you can actually deploy solutions now with the cloud and everything, right? And how cost effective, how you don't have to have $1 million budgets anymore to actually be able to test and deploy solutions. So let me just come back to the original question I had sent you all. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and then within that context, what are you hearing from companies that you interact with in terms of specific barriers, right? Again, then we'll talk to more. We'll spend the rest of the time talking about solutions, but let's just talk about some root issues here. What are those barriers that you hear about? So maybe we'll start with Sky.
Yes. So I am the CEO and founder of Avisare. We are a platform that helps small businesses get contracts to work with the government. And we're really trying to create a new space in the procurement sector by helping these small businesses meet the requirements, find out about the opportunities, and really level the playing field so that they can effectively compete. And we hear, as you can imagine, a number of different complaints about this process. One, that the requirements are designed as such to prevent newer companies from actually breaking in, that the hardest part is breaking in because you have to have been around for X number of years, because you have to have a use case of work that you've already done in the government. And so in order to start work in the government, you have to have done work in the government, which is a vicious cycle. And that, as we mentioned before, and I think as Raj, you mentioned in your opening speech, that the most innovative solutions aren't always able to be scored as effectively as, or understood even as effectively, really. That whole process is really not designed for innovation, and it's not designed for the small businesses.
Yep. Great. And I'll come back to one of those comments.
So my name is Mike Hermus. I actually, before I joined DHS as the CTO, actually not the CIO, before my ex-boss, who was a CIO, yells at me, I get a text from him. I was actually a part of that movement, bringing technology into the government, because I was a software entrepreneur for almost 20 years before joining DHS, and the explicit intent was to try to bring change, to kind of modernize the approach and the technologies that the department were using. And I found in my tour of duty that it's frustrating on both sides. We alluded to this earlier, that there are folks in the government who really want to access those emerging technologies because they understand how much it can accelerate and impact their mission in a positive way. And conversely, there are folks in the startup ecosystem or even late stage kind of emerging tech companies that really would like to break into the government market because they know they have a compelling solution, but they can't. And I remember talking to a number of companies who were so frustrated, and you alluded to this earlier about big companies, but I've seen small companies just effectively give up, saying, I just don't have, and having been an entrepreneur, I understand that the resources around business development and product development are scarce, they're finite. And if you make a decision to invest in a market that may yield zero after years of effort, that's a tough thing for a small company to absorb. So that's the practical challenge, is that how do you, as a company, how do you, as a government, incentivize those folks to actually put the time and effort into engaging when you can't guarantee a payoff? You have to make the barriers low enough that if they don't get business, they didn't, burn their entire, cash runway, and make the reward significant enough that it's worth their time. So I think that's a lot of what you're talking about today, and there are very practical ways that you can help that.
I think that's a great answer. Hi, everyone. I'm Shelly Kapoor Collins. I founded the Shatter Fund to invest in technology companies that are led and founded by female entrepreneurs. Just stepping back a little bit, I'm a corporate techie. I was at Oracle for 10 years, and then I founded my first company in 2008, Enscient Solutions, providing Oracle services to government entities. I've always loved government. I'm one of those people who just wants to be a part of government and wants to make it better, and did that for a few years, and then I took a step into the political world. And from there, I ended up being appointed in President Obama's administration, second one, to his Council for Women in Business. And then from there, I came out and started the Shatter Fund to invest in these tech companies, because I saw the need for getting more female entrepreneurs access to capital so they can scale their companies. And where my heart is when I look at a company to invest in, I don't just want to look at the returns, I want to look at the mission. Is it solving a larger issue? And what I'm finding is that I'm going more and more towards, I wouldn't call it GovTech, but I would call it companies that have a slant towards making government better. And so that's been kind of my passion so far.
And so maybe I could just if you could just tell me a little bit more, tell us a little bit more about specific issues. We talked about companies are frustrated. Sometimes you mentioned the example of RFPs and kind of, but so I think definitely we've heard about the very complex kind of books that we have to respond to. But besides that, what are other specific issues that you hear about?
I mean, I'll just say that sometimes it's just hard. You don't know who to go talk to, right? The government is such a mystery, right? Like you look at it, you see DHS, you see DOD. If you're looking at it from the outside and you just want to get to the right person and show them what services you have or what products you have no idea where to go. I mean, it is really, it's a mystery. And I think a big problem is, the issue is that we need to demystify, make it more transparent and accessible.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, unfortunately, what happens is in the federal market, at least, I don't know how similar local procurement is, but the folks who have the best business development people, who have the relationships, who understand how to navigate that complex maze, are the ones who end up getting in and having the conversations. Not necessarily the folks that have the most compelling solutions. And so there's that unequal playing field. That's, I guess, what you're trying to address, which I think is critically important. And that's, again, a practical problem. If you have to invest in a very expensive federal biz dev team just to get in the door, there's no way that folks can compete.
I don't think it works either. I don't think that model is very successful, to be honest with you.
It's successful to folks who are able to win the big contracts, but it's not necessarily in the government's best interest.
Smaller, that's right.
That's right, yeah.
And it's not just about the business development, it's about lobbyists too, right? If you can invest in the right lobbyists who have the right relationships to get you in the door, then you're more likely to succeed, which again prevents smaller businesses and small companies from even getting in the door to begin with. And so we deal with local and state. We don't really deal with federal.
No, we need to talk then later.
But a lot of the problems are the same in that there's an issue with discovery, there's an issue with transparency, there's an issue with requirements, there's an issue with even understanding. If you think about it, and this is what I really encourage people to do, think about it from the small business perspective, right? They want to find agencies that need their goods and services. And so the first step is just knowing who that is. And so when you have systems, when you have your own closed, even registration systems to notify people about opportunities, you are asking people to register in about 50, 60 different places just to find out what the opportunity is. That is step one. That is a huge barrier. And as we said, these small companies do not have big business development teams that just go searching for these opportunities. Step two is reading through 174 pages of requirements to figure out if they can win a $25,000 contract. Like, that's just not acceptable and not something that a lot of companies have the bandwidth to do. Step three is then trying to meet those requirements, and some of those requirements are just not designed for small businesses, period. One specific example I can give is about requirements for bonding insurance for some construction companies, where you have to be double bonded. As a small business, why would you have to be, it's extremely expensive to be double bonded just to see if you can compete and win a contract. So I think we really have to think through all of these requirements and say, what are these requirements saying about the type of company that we want to win this opportunity?
Raj, you and I talked something about the kind of just the efficiency or lack thereof of the entire marketplace. And at a very high level, you've got like two domains, right? You've got the problem domain, the mission domain, which is, everybody, a lot of folks in this room and online have their own missions and problems that they're trying to solve. And you've got the solution domain, which is all the companies and products and services out there that can help. And there's not a good a way for them to know, right, where those things meet. Right now, the folks on the solution side struggle to navigate. The folks on the government side don't know what's in the solution domain, so they don't understand where they can invest their time and effort. So I think finding a way to increase the liquidity and efficiency of that entire ecosystem is really critical.
Can I ask how many people in this room either have government contracts or are seeking government contracts? Okay, just wanted to get an understanding if this is useful. I will say the other prohibitive factor are the contracts, the contract vehicles, right? So for example, I was sitting in a certain secretary's office last year and took one of our portfolio companies there to meet and said, look, you really should look at their skill set. I do believe in starting at the top and then working my way down. And so went there, presented this company, and they point blank told us that, look, we want to work with them. They have what we need. But we've got these big guys, they've got the contracts, and unfortunately, we know we're paying too much. We know it's not exactly what we want, but we have to buy it. We still have to buy it, and they're spending millions and millions of dollars that they don't, and this is about as high level as it gets, and they are aware. So there is awareness that there is a need for better contracting practices and for bringing in smaller players. They don't have the time to do it.
Let me just also ask everyone here, are people familiar with the I guess, has anybody ever seen a benchmark study or anything about what it takes to respond to a proposal or to an RFP? Like the cost of it? I think we would, it's enormously high, right? And you can imagine if you put players that are of different sizes, you're basically saying everybody has a similar cost, and they're taking a certain percentage of their cost, and then they have to invest it against one opportunity versus others, right? So there's that cost of, we call it cost to serve, is extremely high, when we look at government. And you do have to make a real commitment to invest in a government business or have some type of a set-aside program that might make it easier to access, right? So let me just transition. I think we've talked. I will just highlight one more thing. Actually, is the speed. I think that's the other issue that we hear about a lot is just the speed. And nobody has 6 months to a year for a sales cycle, especially small companies. Right? And
Or
a
more.
lot of large companies.
That's fast.
Yeah, seriously, it's longer.
Right? It's 6 months to a year to actually, wait. And honestly, a lot of programs, if you're trying to serve, critical missions, a lot of programs are frustrated that they have to, when you go with a requirement, they have to wait 6 months to a year to actually fill a requirement. How do you actually meet government's mission, do the critical work that government has to do if you have to wait 6 months? I personally can't imagine. Right. So let's transition a little bit and talk about, we're going to hear about some examples too later, but let's talk about examples. And in terms of, solutions here, are you seeing examples of, the kinds of things that are being done to reduce barriers? Maybe one, you could talk about what those specific things are, and they might be just a corollary to what we just talked about. And then maybe we could talk about some specific examples of companies that have done that.
Sure, I'll start. So on the local and state level, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the San Francisco STIR program, the Startup in Residence program, but I think it's a really innovative program. They they match startups specifically with problems, short-focused problems of, and I see Mariel Reed from here, so she can talk about that more later, but with specific problems from local government agencies, and they have a 16-week residency program where the startup is housed at the agency, working with the personnel at the agency to solve the problem and implement the problem. And then hopefully the idea is for that business to then be able to go on and replicate that and sell to other government agencies with the same problems. And so that concentrated 16-week time period, a very specific but very short brief on what the problem is, allows the startup to work on the solution in an innovative way with the agency instead of the agency saying, hey, here's what we need and this is how to solve our problem. Because again, that's part of the problem when you think that you already know what the solution is, you are limiting yourself to other outside innovative solutions that you might not be familiar with. So I think that's a really good example, and I've seen good examples of agencies doing pilot programs, specifically with smaller companies. However, the problem then again starts to be when that pilot still takes 6 to 12 months and for $5,000 and just goes on and it gets to be prolonged. But I have seen good examples of that happening where it's actually worked well. They've had a really defined period. They have someone owning that project or working with that company from the inside so that the startup doesn't feel like they're just on their own. And then there's a clear path to translating that into an actual contract.
And I would like to come back to kind of the whole issue of pilots and how that potentially helps many companies of all sizes, and in terms of breaking through the sales cycle and speed and everything. But maybe we can come back to that.
And I think, and that's a lot of what you see in the federal government as well. I think that in general, whatever level of government you're at, the principles are not simply looking at the processes and procedures and policies that you have in place and how things are done today, but understanding what you're trying to accomplish and coming up with new ways to do that, focusing very clearly on the outcomes and objectives, and then figuring out the quickest and most effective way to get there. And so some of the things are, have been done actually for quite some time that people aren't even aware of, and that gets to the navigation issue that folks have. Like there's a quasi VC firm called InQtel, which is basically the CIA started. But now it's broadened to all the intelligence community, the Defense Department, and DHS. And they work with innovative emerging tech companies to do programs, pilot programs, to help understand if a technology can be adapted to the particular use cases that the mission area might have. And they invest in them, right? They co-invest with other venture capital firms, and that's a very powerful tool to get exposure and to help. You mentioned DIUX, but one of you mentioned DIUX. There's something called other transaction authorities in the federal government that give folks ways to get access to innovative technology, but folks aren't even aware of it, right? Folks on the government side aren't always aware of it, and folks, certainly in industry aren't aware of it. So I have seen companies use those tools successfully. But I've also seen them used in ways they weren't intended to be used, which then causes a problem for the whole ecosystem. So for example, the Defense Department was trying to use one of those tools to basically jam $1 billion cloud contract, sole source down. And that's not what it was intended for, right? I having been on the buying side, I understand why you'd want to do that, and I certainly appreciate the efforts there. But these were intended to drive innovation and access, new and emerging technology, not simply to make it, shortcut the large procurement process.
And I'll add to that. So the rapid acquisition access that you're talking about. So the DIUX and the DHS, Mosaho, they have that venture
Silicon
arm,
Valley office.
right? The Silicon Valley office. And what I've been doing with them, and what I really appreciate their focus on, is engaging the private sector, right? And engaging people like me at VC firms or entrepreneurs, and saying they circulate the problem set and say, look, this is the issue. Who do you know? Right, so they're partnering with the private sector. We've almost become a funnel for them in some ways in terms of companies that we're sending over, even if they're not our companies, and saying, here's what we're seeing in the market, here's what what we recommend, and then they can become aware of the innovations that are out there, right? Like like MasterCard does that. They want to know what's out in fintech, just not to go off on a tangent, but they want to know what's in fintech. So they, come to us and say, hey, what are you seeing? What are the companies you're seeing? And that's what these guys are doing. They're engaging the private sector and working as partners. But having said that, you still can't put on your website that you're a partner to DHS or the DIUX, because it's not in the rules.
And I was going to say that engagement is critical. And the problem is you need somebody on the inside who has both the time and the focus and the bit of understanding to be able to drive that engagement.
Right.
But that's one of the things that I did as CTO at DHS was we, in addition to working with the Silicon Valley office and things like InQtel, we partnered with the venture firms who had enterprise IT focus and who were really looking at the federal government and started talking to them about their portfolios and try to develop relationships. That takes time. But once those things are firing on all cylinders, it's a very effective mechanism. But you still, at the end of the day, have to solve the problem of getting those companies in the door and actually get contracts. You can have all the relationships you want, but if you don't get contracts.
But do you think rapid acquisition authority and then issuing the problem statement and saying, kind of.
I do think that's great. The problem is, again, it's just not being used in all cases, and sometimes it's being misused. And so, and also the money still has to be there. And this is one thing that and maybe this is unique to federal government, I didn't realize until late in my tenure that this 2 to 3 year procurement process happened to line up with a 2 to 3 year funding cycle. So if you were able to super shortcut the procurement process and got it done in 6 months, so then all of a sudden you're like, well, wait, I have no money for this. And so that's actually a real problem. You could fix the procurement challenge, but if you don't fix the budget cycle and find a mechanism to allocate money for innovation outside of the usual 2 to 3 year RAD process, then you're still stuck.
And on that note, sorry, one more thing. I do know, and we have seen more and more agencies, at least on a local and state level, who have innovation funds, and these innovation funds can be quite sizable, but either they're not being used, they're not widely known about, or there isn't an established process, or at least people don't know what that established process is to access that money. So that's part of the problem as well. And I think the other issue that you guys were talking about with the rapid procurement process falls under the concept of agile procurement, right? Agile procurement processes, which I would love more government agencies to adopt as a whole, instead of having these 174-page RFPs. And let me be clear, I understand that there are issues and there are regulations and there are reasons why some of these RFPs need to be larger and longer. But there are a lot that don't. And so I would just say, like, and I know this takes time and it takes someone who's engaged too, but just to think through what are the types of opportunities and contracting vehicles that do need to take a lot of time and have those long regulations, and what are the ones that don't, and can we at least start to change the ones that don't?
Yeah, if I could just interject here, one thing maybe we could discuss here, regardless of what level of government, I think the whole idea of challenges and competitions has taken off. You see a lot of examples across cities and states. I know Harvard's Kennedy Center. I forget. It's the Harvard Government Performance Lab that has many examples where they're taking a traditional procurement process. So we're not talking about creating a new process. We're taking the regular process, right, and saying, okay, what are the things that can be done to streamline and improve, right? And so I do think that's important to talk about here. So we can create what I would call parallel procurement systems, and create innovation units and everything. But the fact is, there are thousands and thousands of transactions happening all the time, right? That are within the traditional procurement system. Right. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. What are those specific solutions and things, within there? Maybe Agile is a good place to start.
Wow.
What are the characteristics there, that people can adapt, right? And without having to create an innovation, and we will come back to that innovation, and those are important too.
So it's a good segue, because I was just about to try to interject that myself. We at DHS, we had many of you, anybody who's in the federal ecosystem probably knows about the Flash procurement, which was a large agile software development procurement. And it was one of the first of its kind in its size to actually try tech challenges, yep, as opposed to issuing a traditional RFP. And so we effectively first we requested a short, low-budget video for folks to kind of explain their capabilities, not submit anything written, supposed to be shot on an iPhone. And then the folks that we kind of advisory down selected were supposed to come in and do a coding challenge where there was a government product manager, product owner, and a full team would come in for a half-day challenge and actually try to build software. And that was the primary evaluation factor for how we were going to pick these teams. Now, a couple things happened. One, it was way too big. We started off too big. There were over 110 folks that actually responded, and we ended up having to do all these tech challenges, and the government team didn't have the resources, and there were all sorts of challenges there. But the other thing that happened is we started this. We realized that there's some unintended consequences of doing things that way. For starters, whether you tell people to do low-budget films or not, they don't. And as now I'm on the outside talking to lots of the folks who participated in that process and all the lookalike spawns that are happening across government, folks are actually investing a ton of time and money in these videos. So it's not necessarily getting the time or cost efficiency and leveling the playing field that we wanted. And then you're also seeing folks that are basically spinning up almost professional coding challenge teams as opposed to professional procurement writing teams. And so now that has an unintended consequence of, again, not giving the government what it wants necessarily, and also not leveling the playing field the way we wanted. So while that was a great idea and still is superior to a paper RFP, we still have to work through a lot of these changes to make it work for both sides.
I guess one thing I'd ask to that is, how do you learn if you don't try?
That's exactly right.
Right?
Yes.
Like I just want to make that point. I think to the credit, I do know that example. To the credit of the chief procurement officer and the leadership of that agency, they stuck behind their team, right? And they said, hey, there were some mistakes made, right? But how do we learn without actually trying it? And so they stood up in front of everybody and
Yes.
said, we're going to go back.
Not
right?
just our
and take the
procurement
lessons. Because that's the only way I think and I think they are going back.
And it's not just our chief procurement officer, but also our undersecretary for management is like the COO of DHS, who said, look, we have to try these things, and even though this one didn't work out the way we wanted it to, we learned a lot, and we're gonna iterate on that, and that's important.
And I think that's a great, what we're all saying is that you need those internal champions. It doesn't work without them. Someone not only who gets it, but is willing to stand behind it.
Yes.
Right, and push that forward. That's critical.
And so one thing I think that we can do that probably all of you can do that's really, I think, low and easy to do is just to really understand what those processes are, what your requirements are, what you can and cannot buy, how you can and cannot procure it for your own agencies. That's something that we hear all the time, that people just don't necessarily know what those rules are for their own departments, their own agencies, and how to go about procuring different types of opportunities. So I think what we're all saying here is that there's a lot of misinformation, there's a need for transparency and discovery and more easy navigation.
If I could just touch on that point really quick. So discovery, I think, so we're talking about, the name of this panel is around reducing barriers to participation. So one thing that we've discovered through our research is that the discovery process is hard. A lot of times people will know who they know, and it's hard to find, especially a lot of smaller companies, other companies that are coming online, right? So I think that the whole discovery piece is, and you can call it market research, right? Piece is a critical one. I'm just curious here, what are ways to discover those new companies and others that are coming online, besides going back to your procurement directory and seeing the players that you've already worked with, maybe? How do you discover them?
I think we alluded to one earlier, which is really syncing up with the venture community, with developing relationships in the emerging technology community.
Yeah.
And I do think that it would be great. The problem is a lot of these are private companies by definition, like very private companies, and so there's not a big website out there where you can figure out what everybody's doing. But at some point, transparency and visibility to enable that discovery into the venture ecosystem even if it's just maybe for government, would be super useful.
I think, yes, the private sector engagement that we've talked about, but also there needs to be something where folks in the position to procure should know what's out there, and there has to be, I would like to think, some sort of a research, like a portal or some sort of a go-to site where they can say, here's who's doing what in these different categories. Maybe it's drones, right? Like, do you have a drone that can, how long does it take to manufacture a drone? Can you manufacture one on demand in 16 weeks? You can, but how many people know that? And can you actually, can you have it shipped out without, and can it be an unmanned aerial service? Absolutely. How much will you save in your costs, for being able to deploy that technology? So, someone who's procuring drones, how would they know about that company?
Exactly.
Right? So there has to be some sort of a go-to resource where these companies are constantly updated, where they are constantly kept track of, and where these companies are also encouraged just to go and fill out an information sheet, right? Like here's what we do. Almost like, anyway.
So I promise that I did not pay anyone on this panel to tee this up, but you both teed it up very nicely for us. That is exactly what we are doing at Avisare because of this problem, right? Because of that need. When you have literally thousands of different sites where you are managing your own procurement directories, you are managing your own people that you worked with, it is almost impossible to discover what's out there. And even forming the relationships with VCs, which I think is great, we're a venture capital-backed company, but that doesn't necessarily lower the barriers either, because then you're only working with venture capital-backed companies. And especially for minority and women-owned businesses, there's less than 2% of all venture capital-backed companies have a minority or female founder on them. It is very, very hard to break into that space.
That's supposed to be my quote. That's my stat.
Oh, sorry. You take that stat.
You can both take credit.
We'll take credit for that one. But yes, you need a centralized mechanism in order to discover really what is out there.
And I would emphasize that to everyone here too. I think the market discovery and doing we think there's more training required in government, both for programs and procurement, on how to find companies, right? And let's not go to the first step we already know, right? Because especially in tech, there's a lot of new companies coming online, right? New innovations happening. So that's one thing we would emphasize is, look at your market research process and how you do it, and how is there a way to bring in new companies. Second thing maybe we can chat about, and then I want to open it up to some Q&A here, is the whole issue of RFPs and problem statements. I think So one thing we've seen, and you'll hear a bit more about this in the other panel around kind of hacking the process, but it's around, how do we simplify the requirement statement down to more of a problem statement, a problem and outcome statement? So can we move away from specifying requirements to moving towards actually stating what is your real problem if you're a program doing that? And what we've found is most of the time, even the programs don't really know how to define their own problem. They just know a solution. They don't really know what need they're solving for. So, right, specifying the problem and then what does it look like? What are the outcomes if the problem is solved? If you go more towards that, then you give the private sector and your partners out there potentially more leeway to come back with some, real solutions that will help solve the problem. Have you seen any of that?
So I think that concept is, absolutely critical. The fact is that by design, government procurement, at least federal procurement, is supposed to do that. It's not supposed to prescribe the solution, but in practice, what's happened is it's been perverted, and so folks are using the requirements to try to pigeonhole either what they already think they want. To kind of game the system a little bit,
or who they want,
exactly, and then they lose sight of the actual outcome they're trying to drive, and it closes down options for innovative solutions. So not doing that is really, really bad. So conversely, I think everybody needs to do that, focus on the outcomes. And I have seen examples, where that's been done well. In fact, some of the things we talked about earlier, that's exactly what the Silicon Valley office does. They create for DHS, they create short problem statements. They say, here's what we want to do, and then let folks come and show them their solution for that, for that problem. And that is absolutely a superior way of doing it, and I think it works great.
But I agree with Michael that it's still very conceptual, like it's not being done, if at all, right? It's kind of in the MVP stage of it.
Again, it's an area that requires a lot of training because I'll just say, it's getting people to agree on a problem statement is a difficult thing. But, if you're going to spend a lot of time and money on trying to put a solution in place, it's well worth the time to really uncover what problem you're trying to solve for and what success looks like.
And the other thing is sometimes people will phrase their problem statements as like, my problem is I don't have a solution that does this. So it's actually quite hard to get people focused on the action. Yeah.
I actually have seen, this done pretty well and recently in Los Angeles. As you might know, we have a lot of major events coming up in Los Angeles over the next 10 years. World events like the World Cup and the Olympics, which we're all very excited about. And the committee took a look at what was needed to have more engagement with small businesses in Los Angeles so that they can take advantage of more of these procurement opportunities happening. And they wrote a really good problem statement with research and talks and stakeholder interviews, et cetera, about here is the problem as it is laid out. So that was a really great use case of a very simple and clear problem statement with a prescribed solution already.
And I think this is a practical bit of advice. We talked about practical takeaways for everybody who's on the buying side, which is even within the existing process, the more you prescribe, requirements functionally or otherwise, the narrower your options are for innovative solutions. So simply doing just that, inside the existing procurement process will open your aperture for better solutions.
I mean, a general rule of thumb we ask people to follow. Obviously, if it's a new program, a new type of requirement, the more open you can be, the better. Obviously, if it's more mature and you're already in the mode of doing it, then you might know more to prescribe a little bit more, right? But you don't know early on, especially. Well, let me just transition here because we could talk about this. And one thing we will be doing is on our site posting examples. So if you have examples of things you've seen, please send them because the goal is to really share across so we can learn from each other. This is a few minutes for Q&A. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Sure. Vic Chatterjee, City of Los Angeles. Very interesting panel. You guys bring up some really salient points. And I kind of got the sense that you talked around what I feel, and I don't have the answer for this, but what I feel is the fundamental issue with our local government here and perhaps all the way on up is a lack of a digital strategy, if you will. And especially, and some of the issues may be that we're federalized systems, one department doesn't work with the other, they don't have a unified way to do things digitally for technology's purposes. Where do you see that, or do you see that changing, or is that just one of those major barriers, the political part of it, if you will, is that you can consider that a barrier that prevents the established digital policies that would help to bring in the small companies?
So I'll take a quick stab at that. I think it's less that people don't have a digital strategy. I think the root cause of almost every single problem in this area boils down to a human capital problem, which is that we don't have digital expertise and digital experience and digital understanding, and that the people that are charged with all the various pieces and parts of the ecosystem, whether it be the procurement side or execution or some side of the mission side, don't understand enough about what they need to understand to make the changes that are necessary. So I think that what we really need, because if you have smart folks who understand the issues at hand and how the world is changing, they will guide the organization, whether it's through a formal strategy or otherwise. They will help the organization navigate the shifting world around them in the right direction. But without the people who understand it, trying to put together a digital strategy with a bunch of folks who don't understand digital generally or technology generally is going to be a losing proposition. So I think it boils down to the people.
I agree with that, and in fact, I'm going to support that with two examples. So again, the Obama administration started two programs. Both are still in effect. One is the USDS, the U.S. Digital Services component, and the whole goal was to bring in very high-level, well-known CTOs and CIOs into the government to provide a digital roadmap, right? So they did do that, and they are still doing that. And then they additionally started something called the Presidential Innovation Fellows, right? They wanted to bring these folks into government, these really great, capable, high-level techies, but they wanted to recognize them for that, and they wanted to make it a sexy thing. And so they created this program just to bring in that digital talent that Michael's talking about. But then there is the reality of decentralized systems, right? Each agency has their own system. How do you get them all to work together? So it became a matter of scale. Can you have the USDS folks replicate exactly what they've done for DHS, in the DoD, in the VA? And so there's a scale issue as well.
It doesn't have to be people from the outside either. I mean, I think that's important. I think you have a few folks who are really experts to drive that change, but you obviously have an existing workforce you can't just toss aside, nor would you want to. And so you have to find solutions for upskilling, and training the workforce.
I agree with that, 100%.
Yes. And through that upskilling and training the workforce, because I know in the city of Los Angeles we have a problem here, and that problem is that almost half of the workforce is retirement eligible within the next couple of years. So we're going to lose a lot of people, right? And we need to bring in a lot of people. And so what I think we need to do is really partner with some of these digital experts to help form those trainings and those workshops so that we can upskill the people who are already there, and then of course bring in more people into the system, because that's what we really need to do.
And by the way, bringing more people into the system, which is a growing challenge in certain domains like cybersecurity and other just kind of very technical domains. And I think as the lone white male on the panel, I'll highlight the power of diversity in that regard, and really trying to get particularly women and girls more involved in technology early on is going to unlock a big workforce that doesn't exist right now. I think there's a lot of focus on that. I think it's going to have pay great dividends.
And then to the other point that we mentioned about scale, yes, it's hard on a federal level, it's hard on a local level as well. And that's not just Los Angeles, that is everywhere on a local level. So I don't think we can try and say that we will have everyone on one system. It's just not going to work with our processes and with our politics. I really think we need some level on top that can connect with all of these systems, but that doesn't make people have to change all of their systems, because it's just an impossible task.
Well, in many ways, you could say, I think the challenge sometimes is even bigger at the local level, because you have, a lot of the services provided on a daily basis impact people's lives, right? They touch people very closely, right? So if you have potholes, if you have flooding in some neighborhood, right, that needs to be addressed right away. And if you have, the speed becomes an issue. how do you access some of these solutions becomes an issue. Excuse me. Any other, one thing actually I will just quickly add on the digital workforce is I think as you all are looking at solutions, and everybody who's listening online, as you're looking at solutions, one of the things that also across all levels of government that we've seen, very different from private sector, is that we don't have people that are organized. Like, so the CIO teams aside, within procurement, you need people that are organized just to buy IT. There's more and more of that happening, but a lot of times that isn't. So because it's really complex to be able to say what's happening in cyber, right? So you need people that are just doing that, right? And there's no way in any sector that anybody could do it. So you need people organized and really to be doing almost the same thing on a regular basis, right? So that they can become experts on their customers' knowledge, but they can also then really start to know what's happening, for instance, in cybersecurity and how are things changing? What are the new tech companies coming online? And you can't know that if you have to go swim across 20 different things on a weekly basis, right?
But you can't just have digitally savvy people in procurement tech or IT buying.
Oh, yeah.
Every industry is impacted by technology right now. So everyone needs to know about the digital tech. Not everyone needs to be a coder or a programmer, but everyone needs to know about tech.
I think we have a company later presenting Storm Sensor, which is about the issue of drainage, right? Mm-hmm. And it's about tech, though. So you would have never thought about, I think, to your point.
And the geeks shall inherit the earth.
Sorry, you got, and then we'll take another question there.
Sorry, so very interested in this idea of a problem statement versus having requirements in the RFP. I find it sort of your view of how difficult it is to respond to something that has a lot of requirements, but I think on the government side, the requirements are the thing that make sure that the contractor performs. And in fact, most of the risk that a government worker has is failure, right? That there's no bonus for taking extra risk. And so the process is set up in a way to make sure that the requirements are clear at the front end so that the contract can be written clearly so that you know what the deliverables are. So how do you match up those two pieces? Is there a two-step process to it? Is it, first the problem and then you spend time writing the requirements together?
So I think you hit it on the head, right? In government is risk averse, and so therefore, failure is not an option. Failure is not an option, and the other thing, at least in the tech world, failure is a badge of honor. So how do you bring those two things together? I think it's interesting. You said the process is set up. Where is that process set up? Where is that written that it has to be like that? It is a mindset, right? And that's the change that's what I'm asking. Where is that process that's set up? Is it
Attorneys.
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 I guess, but still,
Attorneys is a good point, yeah.
But I guess my point is still that there is room to make that change, right? It's not that it's a process that's so rooted. It's a mindset. It's a cultural shift that needs to happen. And so having said that, I think, there needs to be more tolerance for, with new technologies, there is the chance of more risk, but there's also greater chance of efficiencies and greater chance of cost savings. And I think having that equation in mind and then taking that risk is a lot more helpful.
I spent the better part of 3 years dealing with this exact problem, which was that as we were trying to bring agile software development to the government, and particularly it's particularly applicable in software development, right? Because what was happening was, you're exactly right. They wanted the requirements specified ad nauseum so they could throw them over the wall to a contractor to deliver and then come back 2 years later to say, did you do it or did you not do it, right? And that was the mechanism by which they judged the success or failure of the program. So the concept of going away from that led everybody to scratch their heads. How do we possibly oversee and evaluate and measure this program? And so we did make a tremendous amount of progress in going towards outcome-based requirements, which is saying, look, the requirement is not that you deliver these 100 features or capabilities. The requirement is that we improve, the outcome of this particular mission. We reduce adjudication time. We increase the throughput of a particular process. We, increase the accuracy of a particular process, right? And not only is that what is set in the contract, but that's how the programs are measured and overseen at the end of the day. And that the powers on high don't say, it's either in or out. You did these requirements or you don't. They say, hey, how much progress are you making towards the goals of impacting your mission in a positive way? And should we keep investing, in the continued development of this system or capability to continue to get that benefit? And it's not easy, but we're making progress.
And I'm going to add on to that. So to your point of requirements, right? So I was at Lawrence Livermore National Lab 10 years ago. I was implementing Oracle services for them through our company. And following the requirements, they brought in an HR system that was not known to anyone, but the system matched the requirements. We got through about 6 months and $25 million before Lawrence Livermore scratched that system and went back to the old system. So they followed the requirements and they met it, but what was on paper did not match the people in the room and what they wanted. And so I think there needs to be room for that.
And let's be clear, I understand that they're attorneys. We have to work with attorneys. It's not fun. It is not
We'll
easy.
have a conference with attorneys.
And nothing that we're saying is going to be solved overnight. There is no quick and easy fix to this. It's a huge problem, which is why it's been a huge problem for a long time. We're just trying to talk about solutions and steps, incremental solutions and steps that we can take to make this better, that we can all practically implement right now.
I will say, I think just, and then maybe we'll take one question and we have to then kind of to stay on time, but just one point on that is, I think you've stated that even if you accomplish the requirements, what we've seen is a lot of times people, but you're still not accomplishing the goal, right? So we accomplished the requirement, great, we can check that off, but then we're having to go back and redo things over and over. So ultimately, both from a cost standpoint and a time standpoint, we're spending a lot of time not solving the real problem. So and that necessarily procurement isn't necessarily the one to solve it, it's the programs. So, and one last question.
Hi, Patrick Atwater, work for a coalition of local water. Hi, Patrick Atwater, work for a coalition of local water utilities. I'm struck by a lot of the things that we complain about were put in place by a progressive reform movement a century ago to deal with like very real issues of government corruption, things like that. Looking towards what I would argue is like the civic technology movement, kind of our generation's good government movement, what would you say if you had like one policy wish list to advocate, particularly for like mid-sized cities, other local governments that don't come to shiny conferences like this, they're kind of very disconnected from this world to advocate for, what would you say is like your top thing that could be implemented?
Just one? You go first.
I have to think about that.
Maybe we can make that another speed round here. It's one thing that you could do, the governments could implement.
I like the concept of good government because you're right, that's where we are now. We're recognizing that the outcome is the service to the constituents, right? Like that's what it's about. So what do we need to put in place to make sure that we're delivering those cost savings to constituents? So I'll have to think about that.
I would say that you identified the root issue is that all these regulations and bureaucratic processes were put in place to ensure fairness and equity and lack of waste and corruption and all those things. Those are all very laudable goals. We need those. Like no one wants to go back to a day where that's happening. But what's happened is it doesn't function the way that it was intended to function. It actually has become counterproductive. So I would say this is not a simple policy prescription, but what really needs to happen is the government needs to understand the outcomes it's trying to drive in its own procurement processes and constantly focus on whether or not it's achieving those outcomes in the process. And if it's not, it needs to fix it, and it needs to keep trying, and just like we talked about, trying something new to get to innovative solutions, and when that doesn't work, they fix that. But they need to keep in mind not that the policy or the process is doing what they said it was going to do, but that the outcomes the government is trying to achieve are being met. And right now, they're often not being met, and people don't even recognize it or are aware of it.
I would say, following up on that point, assign a point person to review the policies and make fast changes if those changes need to be made and implemented, right? So if people within procurement, if people within contracting, if people within the agency as a whole have an issue and they find a policy that they're bumping up against, they know who to go to say, this is my issue with this policy, can you review it? And potentially make changes with it. So just even implementing that as a process could really, I think, have a huge impact on all of this.
I would just add that look at unintended consequences. A lot of times these policies are put in place with a very singular view with blinders on. You look at, hey, we're trying to solve one specific issue, but then you're creating a lot more, right? And so we need to really understand the full impact of policies when we're implementing that. Well, thank you so much to the panel here. Hopefully we have some, I think we got some great takeaways.